Hello! Today, for the first time in a little while, I'm returning to discuss some Tekken, with a look at the character of Lars Alexandersson. Now, to date, most of the Tekken characters I've discussed, whether it's Kazuya, Yoshimitsu, or Paul, have been products of the old school Tekken series, debuting from the outset of the games, and thus integrated into the popular consciousness of the series, and the fans of the series. But by comparison, Lars, having debuted in Tekken 6, is very much the adverse of that. He is, we might say, the new school of Tekken character. But I think he's worth discussing nonetheless, particularly looking at the advent of Tekken 8, because I feel his role in the story, though it's been short-lived so far, represents the next phase of the Tekken saga and represents a departure from what's become of the Mishima bloodline so far. Now, when Lars debuted back in Tekken 6 as the illegitimate son of Heihachi Mishima, I think there was some scepticism among longtime fans, particularly those who were invested in the core Mishima story, because with Heihachi, Kazuya, Jin, and indeed Lee Chaolan already battling one another and battling for control of the Mishima Zaibutsu, introducing yet another family member seemed like a further complexity for an already complex and convoluted story. But actually, I think Lars brings something new to the table, and through the passage of time and looking at the long-term prospects for the story, I think he does have potential, and I think his role may well increase as the series wears on. And what I mean by that is, while yes, there was a lot of Mishima stuff going on back in Tekken 6, what we've already seen as of Tekken 7 and moving now into Tekken 8 is the quite convincing demise of Heihachi, the narrowing of the Mishima feud to focus and quite possibly conclude the vendetta between Kazuya and Jin, and thus this leaves an opening for a new stage of the saga to take place, which Lars, Lee Chaolan, and so on might plausibly fill. So why does Lars work so well as a new entrant to the Tekken and indeed the Mishima bloodline story? Well, I think there's a case to be made for him being not necessarily the main protagonistic force, because Tekken is a game of anti-heroes after all, and it has been from the outset, but I think we could argue he is one of the genuine and one of the purer forces for good within the Mishima family just now, because where Kazuya's fall from grace came very quick, and indeed he's always been driven by revenge anyway since the first game, and Jin, for his part, has been increasingly torn between good and evil, with his corruption coming on quite strongly in Tekken 5s and 6. Lars, by comparison, has this strong sense of right and wrong. He has a strong moral compass and a sense of justice, and so perhaps he might well be considered the only uncorrupted and genuinely good character to come out of the Mishima bloodline. So I quite like that, and as I say, over time I think his position within the story will become much clearer and much more prominent as the core Mishimas finish one another off, and even Tekken 7, which focused primarily on Kazuya and Heihachi's conclusive vendetta, it did give a sense of Lars's potential within the story, and how this former Tekken Force soldier has led a military coup against his employers, positioning him firmly against both Heihachi and Kazuya, but leaving the door open to see what happens with Jin in the future too. Because, of course, while Jin was the clear protagonist from Tekken 3 onwards, the later games have certainly sullied his purity and made him a much more conflicted personality, with, of course, the devil Jin element and that sort of thing. And I discussed this in my recent Jun Kazama and Tekken 8 discussions, because I think a lot of this is going to come to fruition in Tekken 8, and what her involvement will have as an impact on Jin's character, whether he becomes good or evil. And I think whatever happens with Jin, as I say, I've discussed this at length in the past, it will undoubtedly correlate directly with Lars in the upcoming games. So whether they stay allies or whether there's an upcoming rivalry, it remains to be seen. Now, turning to Lars in terms of aesthetics and moveset, I actually loved what they did here, because while of course he is of Mishima blood and they are Japanese, what they actually did, and they do this a lot in Tekken and of course other fighting games such as Street Fighter, is they really like to promote the internationality of the character rosters as they increase. And so making Lars for all intents and purposes, Swedish by nationality, was a good choice, I think. I think he may well be the first Scandinavian in the roster, off the top of my head. And I believe part of the reason for the decision to make him Swedish, according to Harada, was that there's quite a big Tekken fan base there. But regardless of that, I like how they incorporated the subtle touch of the Mishima in Lars, despite him being Swedish, because he has this slightly wild hair, but otherwise they removed him from being a carbon copy of like Kazuya, Jin, or indeed Heihachi in terms of visuals. Another thing I love about his design is he really emphasises this sense of being a conventional hero. As I alluded to, I think he is a genuinely good character. And as stated, one of the few that we've actually seen in Tekken, particularly a Mishima, because looking at his attire, he often wears kind of caped and cloaked apparel that subtly nods, I think, to this traditional idea of a hero, the comic book hero of Marvel or DC, and this popular notion that heroes wear capes. And this is combined with a hybridized Tekken Force soldier attire, which nods to his role in the story, his origins in the franchise, because of course he was once allegiant to the Mishima Zaibotsu before swiftly stepping into this heroic leadership capacity against them. I think likewise with his moveset, Lars was a great departure from the heavy thudding tactics of Mishima karate in favour of this swift, flashy, but quite improbable combat style that falls under the moniker of Tekken Force martial arts. And again, I like this because it is a cosmetic and a gameplay departure from what we've seen before with his other family members. And again, it distinguishes him within the wider roster of Tekken. So in all, I think Lars is a great contribution to the game story. He's full of potential and full of narrative importance that hasn't quite peaked yet. And I think regardless of what becomes of Jin and Kazuya, there will be a role for Lars to play in the next game and indeed subsequent games. And I can even see the potential for him becoming the face of the series by the time Tekken 9 rolls around, if Jin, for whatever reason, fails in his redemption arc, becomes incapacitated like Kazuya in Tekken 3, or otherwise enters into contention rather than friendship with Lars for whatever reason. Of course, that's not a given, because, for example, we have Asuka Kazama, who's related to Jin, which seemed to hint that she would become important, but that sort of petered out as the games wore on. Hopefully that won't happen with Lars, because he has been quite integral up to this point. So there we have it. If you got this far, thanks for listening, and I hope you enjoyed it. Feel free to drop a comment letting me know your thoughts on Lars. And if you enjoyed this Tekken episode, you may want to have a look back through and see some of the other character and game discussions that feature on the channel.